So yesterday, Tim talked about Maundy Thursday and what happened on Maundy Thursday in the Last Supper that Jesus has with his disciples. And one of the things that Jesus leaves them with, one of the last things that he teaches them, is to serve one another, to love one another. And he does this and shows this by washing each of their feet. One of the greatest acts of service that someone back then could do for someone else was to wash their dirty feet. It's after this supper and after they share this meal that they go to a place called Gethsemane. And it's here where Jesus spends some time in prayer. He spends some time with his Father praying. And Jesus knows what's about to happen. No one else then knew what was going to happen just a few short days later. Jesus knew what was going to happen. And he even in one of his prayers, he says, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus fully understands what's about to happen. But as we watch this unfold, we understand the seriousness and we understand the burden that Jesus is feeling with this. It's after this time of prayer in Gethsemane where the crowd is sent, where the government sends the crowd and they come and they actually arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, fast forward to the next morning, and that's where we find ourselves today. We find ourselves here on Friday. Some people coin this and call this Good Friday. But early in the morning, on that Friday, Jesus goes before Pilate. And it's there before Pilate, who's the governor at the time, that Jesus is tried. Jesus is accused of a crime that he didn't really commit. Matter of fact, the crime that they say he has done is by claiming himself the King of the Jews. And when Pilate asks him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus simply responds by saying, "I guess I am what you say I am, if you're the one that's calling me that." But as Pilate is trying Jesus, and then Jesus is brought before the crowd and all the people, something just isn't sitting right with Pilate, and he doesn't really want to go through with this. And so he even gives the crowd an opportunity or a chance to let Jesus go and to pick somebody else. But the crowd starts chanting, "Crucify him, give us Jesus, we want Jesus." And this is the same crowd that just a few days before were lining the streets into Jerusalem that we talked about this past Sunday. Lining the streets in Jerusalem with the palm branches and taking off their cloaks and essentially worshiping Jesus as he's riding the donkey into town because they think he's the king that's come to save them. This is the same crowd that's now yelling, "Crucify him," that we want Jesus. And it's interesting then because Pilate has no choice as the crowd is chanting this, and they essentially accuse and try Jesus, and he's sentenced to death on a cross. And it's after he's sentenced to death on a cross that he's beaten, he's mocked, he's flogged. They even, with the idea of him being claimed as the King of Jews, they take a thorn branch and they turn it into like a crown, and they put it on his head, and they force it down into his head until it's gashing into his head. And they beat him some more. And then they force Jesus to carry his own cross to the place where he's going to be crucified. Jesus is then nailed to a cross with the same sign above his head that is what his charge is, where it says, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." After a few hours of hanging on that cross, Jesus cries out in a loud voice. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I would imagine that the Jews back then would have known right away what Jesus was referencing to. In my Bible, it's actually in the footnotes where it says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it points back to Psalms. And in Psalm 22, exactly where it's pointing back, and it's a psalm that David wrote. But in verse 1 of Psalm 22, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning?" That's what Jesus would have been referencing when he was hanging on the cross. And then shortly after that, Jesus takes his last breath, and it says that he commits his spirit. And that's what the people are left with. The people are left with this feeling of hopelessness, this feeling of everything that Jesus had said he was and was going to be doing. And he's hanging there on the cross, lifeless. But it's interesting in that psalm, as I continue to read through the whole thing, it starts off with, my God, why have you forsaken me? But as you read further, it ends on a more positive note, because I think as the psalmist, as David is writing, he understands the seriousness and the way that Jesus was feeling, the way that sometimes that we feel of, God, why have you forsaken me? Have you turned your eyes? Have you turned your head from me and you don't see what's going on? There's nothing you can do. But as David continues to write this psalm, specifically as I look in verse 24 of Psalm 22, it says, "For he has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." See, God knew that a sacrifice had to be made so that we could live eternal life with him in heaven. The sin of the world, the sin that we have, those choices and those things that we do, that God says, I can't be a part of that. The sin that keeps us from fully understanding or fully being in the presence of God. God knew that there had to be a penalty for that sin. And so while it looked like God was forsaking Jesus, what he really knew and understood was that Jesus was making the perfect sacrifice. Jesus had done nothing wrong. He was what they call the sacrificial lamb, the perfect lamb. He had done nothing wrong, completely flawless. Yet he had to die so that we could live eternally with God in heaven. So when we look at this and we call this Good Friday, sometimes it doesn't sound like, why would it be Good Friday when we're celebrating the death of Jesus? Until we wrestle with this idea that a payment had to be made, a sacrifice had to be made, and Jesus willingly gave up his life so that we could live eternally in heaven. But we know that because we continue to read and we know what's going to come in a couple of days. Back then, they would have been left with the death of Jesus. Jesus would have been taken from the cross that evening. His body would have been prepared. He would have been put in the tomb. And the people would have gone to sleep that night, not knowing what was going to happen.